did talk about how narratives, especially when we were talking about media transportation, how narratives work, at least in part, through identification, that we identify with other people's stories, with who other people are, and we talked about the notion of consubstantiality, or sharing substance, and people were saying, well, what kind of substance? Is it material substance? Yes, it can be. Is it physical substance? Yes, it can be that. Is it, more psychological sharing of minds? It can be that. All of that is sharing of substance. And I think it was a good example on Monday, and I know you weren't here for that, Sarah, but the collage was evidence of, I think, identification and consubstantiality among that group of teenagers going into young adulthood who all had the same affliction of cystic fibrosis. They all had to deal with those terrible symptoms that we read about and we saw, but it produced tight friendships among that group of people. And I think it was evidence of consubstantiality, both because they had these physical afflictions that they shared, but also their stories overlapped, and there was a lot of love and support there, which we saw through the collage. So that would be an example of stories helping to form community. And so we see support groups among people with various problems. Some of those could be illness problems, but some of those are just life problems, Support groups are really popular, and then face-to-face ones, but also online, all kinds of affiliations, and people do share stories, which helps them to bond. They may be really different in other ways, but there are certain overlaps that they have that bring them together as a community. So I put that together in organizing this workshop with the notion of activism, because I think you can be an individual activist on your own. You don't have to be part of a community, but more often than not, activism does take place as a community, because that's how you have the most impact, right? If you're just one person out there being active, you may not get the results you want, but if you can get other people to work with you, then that's something else. You have more power that way. And so, I don't know about here in Singapore, in the US now, there's all these kind of petition drives. Do you have that here? So I get stuff from change.com all the time with usually very good pro-social kinds of things, but the idea is to get as many people on board as possible. So, so definitely not all communities are activists, but I think most activism takes place in communities, and that's why I put those two things together. So the piece that I gave you to read by Lynn Carter, and you've heard me mention her before, she's one of the leading narrative scholars for sure, but she comes at it through also being an organizational communications scholar. So she's interested particularly in that interface between narratives and organizations, and how those and how narratives serve the purposes of organization. And that is kind of what her, not kind of, that is what this chapter is about, that she's writing about. And I won't try and reiterate everything that she says in there, but just to pull some of the important points out of there. So she's saying there's, oftentimes it begins with biographical kind of life stories that become, and I'm searching for the word that she used, oh here, a mobilizing narrative. It gets people activated, and that might happen as it did in this example here. So she's talking about a woman who very unfortunately lost a young daughter to cancer, and for most people, and she talks about this, parents can't even bear to think about this, but she reacted in a different way. And she thought, to honor her daughter's memory, that she could try and fix some of the problems that she experienced during this illness period. Okay, so there's something that happens in the course of one's life that it's just, it mobilizes you to action, and that's what happened here, and that's often how activism starts. So this mother started this organization to get socio-emotional support for families where there's childhood cancer. And she was kind of a lone voice in the wilderness when she started this, because there's other activism that includes childhood cancer, but as she said, most of that is focused on getting a cure. And obviously she's not against getting a cure, but there's other problems to be solved. Until there is a cure, there's going to be kids with cancer, and those families are going to have needs. So she began to organize for this, and what Harder pulls out of this is that stories then become kind of mobilizing forces within organizations and between organizations. And I like this metaphor that she uses, if I can find it here, but I think she says there's, and she may be quoting somebody else, but that stories can serve both as a mirror and a lamppost in terms of organizations. So the mirror part is what? It's reflecting what's going on among the people in the organizations. It reflects their biographical stories and those mobilizing kind of narratives. But the lamppost is a different metaphor that also works. What does the lamppost suggest? Remember? What she's saying is that it moves the organization forward, that it sheds a light on where to go and how to build this. So it's not just an inward mirror, but it's an outward kind of light moving organizations forward. And she gives several examples of how that might work. So the narrative scaffolding that she talks about is, she calls it a story building process, that people coming together for purposes of organizing about an activist cause share their stories among them, and those stories relate to one another, again, intertextuality, and it builds an inner structure for those organizations, and that's the notion of scaffolding. she also brings up, and she calls what's happening within these organizations a collective storytelling system. Now, obviously, storytelling isn't the only thing that happens in these organizations, but she sees that as a basic kind of building block that holds that organization together. And I thought that was an interesting way of describing it, a collective storytelling system. She also talks some about what she calls narrative indeterminacy, which basically means that narratives, your story keeps going. It doesn't stand still in time. It moves through time with you, and it changes. It's dynamic. And that's what she's referring to as far as narrative indeterminacy. And then probably one of the most important ideas, concepts that comes out of this is what she's calling the notion of narrative capacity. And I think what she's talking about, she and her colleagues, there were 4 authors on this, I don't mean to ignore the other ones, but how storytelling then not only holds the organization together, but allows it to function in a more optimal way and to move forward with its agenda. Part of that is to overlap stories with other organizations, and she gives examples of how she was able to extend the good, really, that her activist organization could do by working with other organizations that have some similar interests but are not there exactly to do the same thing. So one of the things that she gives an example of is that it sounds like her organization has been relatively successful in fundraising, but then she ran into trouble when she tried to directly use those funds within some of the hospital systems that she was working with, because there's all kinds of bureaucracy and bureaucratic roadblocks. But there were other organizations with some similar kinds of interests that were already functioning within the hospital, so that she was able to fund some of her funds to the other organizations so that they could make those funds work. And she says it's not about who gets credit. It's about, and this is obviously a very good attitude for this woman to have, it's about getting the stuff to the people that need it, getting the help to the people that need it. But she says we were able to do that because there are some similar tendencies in our storytelling that help our organizations link together. So that would be one example of narrative capacity. Another one that she talks about quite a bit is hearing the stories, and the woman in charge of the organization that they're looking at says that she spends a lot of time going online and talking with parents who are in support groups and really trying to listen to their stories, because they come from that. She gets ideas that are beyond her own experience, and she translates them into help. So she has these care packages that she gives to the families of children with cancer, and the ingredients, the products that are within those care packages has grown, I think she said, to more than 40 different things. And that's because she went beyond her own story. She listened to other people's stories, found out what they needed, and then expanded the care packages. So hearing the stories of others is another way of increasing capacity. And then one of the other things that she talks about is getting the story of her organization out there and disseminating what they've learned to other people. And she hired an IT person to help her because the internet has all kinds of resources for doing that. So they're sending out tweets, they're getting, she writes a newsletter, but then they take what's in the newsletter and they get it out online in other forms. So they're reaching as many people as possible. Another kind of narrative capacity building. I thought it was really interesting about, they're talking about message design also, really, because they're saying, how can we design the message so that it moves us up, so when you Google something, our name comes up pretty close to the top. All of that is a way of getting their story out there and reaching a wider audience. So those, it's a nice chapter, and those were some of the concepts that I wanted to pull out of there for you. So the movie we're going to watch, we'll start it now, is an older movie. You're not going to find examples of going online in this movie, but this is a true story, and I don't have the syllabus with me, but I might have put the year there, that it was sometime in the 90s. And this was a regular feature-length film that was, it's okay, Daniel. We don't have to fish it out, but
That's 92.
92, so early 90s. It was a regular feature-length film in the theaters and had big stars, so Susan Sarandon and Nick Nolte star in it, and they're telling a true story about, actually this started with very an individual family, again, not unlike family here, who had a lot of trouble getting their story out, as you will see. And they took on the medical establishment, and they did something quite remarkable. And in the process, they did help to form community. So I'd like you to keep the concepts that Harder and her colleagues are talking about in terms of a mobilizing narrative, what mobilized these efforts, and how the story worked within the family and the close associates of the family. They didn't have like a formal organization like this did, but then how they extended their narrative capacity to reach other people and accomplish something. So let's just keep that in mind, and we can start anytime.
I think in the reading as well, they're talking about how activist narratives can exploit the gaps in, or not exploit, but at least make it evident that there are gaps in the dominant narrative, which showed up in the movie quite a bit. Like, you know, testing trials take too long, you're on a different time schedule as people who are really down with this disease.
Yeah. I haven't watched Lorenzo's Oil for a long time. I was glad that they mentioned the AZT trials for AIDS at the end, because it helps us to see this isn't an isolated case. And actually the AIDS activists got their story out really well.
Well, I was looking at Wikipedia actually, and it turns out the boy Lorenzo lived until he was 30.
Wow.
Wow. I was just wondering what is like the way that happened since 1990.
Did they say anything about the brain transplants that they talked about there?
I don't think so.
I don't think that it's gotten to that but it made me think I should check into this. I have a sister with multiple sclerosis, so if they could regenerate myelin, that would help her for sure.
Yes.
What do you take from this in terms of narrative and activism or community?
Every time I see this couple talk with doctors, I feel that this is their kind of like ambivalent roles that they play. That the wife is always, my narrative as a parent, and it's my boy. And then the father is more like, this doctor is simply providing his own narrative or being objective something. So he's trying to find commonality so that his own agenda, or whatever you call that, a parent's wish can be delivered or can be pushed forward. So that makes that means to me very important thing that when we do activism, is it to come up with an entirely new world or find some special connections with the biomedical science. So basically in our research, usually we say that this is biomedical or this is biomedicine, and therefore, let me start with my local community's voice. Now, is this entirely right? I do not know. But then this movie gives me the perspective that, we need to really also have some understanding, at least, of biomedicine, so as to really push forward, to combine our effort so that there won't be purely dominant biomedicine or purely alternative method. There has to be a kind of collaboration in the two.
Yeah, the activism has to work with the status quo in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess in some cases it could replace the status quo, but in this case it couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
They ultimately needed the scientists, they needed the doctors, but also the medical establishment needed that parental drive
Yeah.
to get them to look at alternative ways.
Yeah. So in the end, I see that it's like a change on both sides. This side takes Lorenzo's oil. That side, become more knowledgeable in biomedical science, so as to be granted their honorary medical degree. And then to me, it's combining effort. So if we take this as a metaphor, I do not know how fictional this one is, or
No,
it is
this is a
based
true
on a real
story.
a true story. Okay, great.
This is
Then-
a true story.
Yeah, then can we think back about this Chinese traditional medicine or in Indian traditional medicine? Is it entirely comfortable to group them as alternative therapy? Or to what extent that Chinese medicine can learn from Western medicine and to be better integrated into Western medicine?
That's why I'm studying integrative medicine.
Yes, great.
So in the way the story is presented via the film,
Mm-hmm.
the O'Donneys are the protagonists, even though the mother is kind of a tough protagonist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of extreme. And like you said, the father mediates between all sides, between her sister and her and the doctor. What kind of characters are the doctors, and the people that run the parents' organization? How would you characterize them as characters?
What's the question again?
How would we characterize some of the other people in the film, like the doctor, the doctor / scientist? The actor is Peter Ustinov. I forget what his name is in the and the people that head the parents group. What kind of characters are they in this plot?
For the doctors, I was a lot less sympathetic to the parents of the group for some reason, and I wanted to not like that. Like I wanted the doctors to be the villain, and like I wanted to be mad at them for not doing it, but I did feel for them being stuck in the structure that they are, and I was thinking like exactly what the doctor said at the end, like what if I, on this one case, prescribe this for so many people and then it goes wrong, and not just for his reputation purpose, which I guess he didn't really say this part, but for me I was thinking like, well, he's caused harm, and like as his oath as a doctor, you know, to do no harm, like he's got a lot to negotiate with that. And for parents who have like nothing to lose to just try anything, it's a very different, a very different environment. And so I wanted the doctor to do it, and I wanted him to take a risk, but I also really sympathized with the fact that he wasn't able to. And I don't know if that's because I come from that system as well, but I didn't have the same sympathy at all for the parents of the group, of the foundation.
And why not?
I don't know.
I mean, weren't they trying to be protective of the other parents? Was that their main what were the motives at work here?
You know what scares me a little bit? I don't know whether it's a parallel that I would want to draw, but aren't the parents of the presidents or the leaders of that organization doing pretty much what Diane is doing as well, like offering the support, offering the emotional care?
That's what
they were aiming for, right? So in a way, I'm not sure how fair it is that the movie villainizes them so much for trying to, you know, it is something not to raise someone's hopes, especially if it's false hopes. I'm sure they have a right to be careful, but you know, in the whole scheme of this movie,
I mean, we're actually getting into a medical ethics kind of thing, because then the O'Donneys say, but is it ethical to withhold information where parents can make a choice? So
Yes.
I think you're right that they're not totally wrong. Their motives aren't totally wrong, but we come into an ethical dilemma where there's two values that are in conflict with each other. But yeah, they do sort of come off villainized.
I see this as different layers of social activism, like the parents. There's what's that foundation or
yeah, the foundation.
They raise awareness and then give offer comfort or counseling, things like that. That's also one layer of activism. Actually, I think that at the end of the movie, the information of the oil actually was disseminated through this, although
Against their
against
will.
the will of the president. Still, I'm thinking that in terms of how any kind of achievement is based on the infrastructure. Like if they do not have that national or very large library, how could the parents, even with the will, to get that? If they do not have that supporting foundation where all the parents of this same disease gather. Hopefully they get the first, get inside their camp, or to raise more questions. So basically I see that, if these parents have achieved something, it's not achieved in a void or in a total black or darkness. So in this sense, I'm saying that these foundations and doctors, even if after the certain kind of information, they will say that no, I will not do that. I will not do this. It gives, in a sociological sense, a kind of basis for this achievement of the parents. So I'm, in this sense, saying that social activism needs its social infrastructure, and then in that sense also, then the foundation itself is a kind of social activism already.
Yeah, so, I mean, for a long time, they were flying without that infrastructure, and it was, the parents were, and it was tearing them apart. I mean, they could have floundered right there. And interestingly, I think they needed that, what did she call it, the scaffolding, with the stories coming together. The other mother really helped them with that. Probably without her getting up and giving testimony, it would have floundered right there.
Yeah.
At least as the story is presented to us. Yeah. Well, I don't know how many people we're going to end up with. We're dwindling down here, but Pauline had to leave. She had a conflict today. Tomorrow we're going to watch a shorter film. This was the longest one. And we'll be talking about what happens when, as participants in a narrative and as viewers of a narrative, the narrative we think we know collides with other information. And just like there was a conflict in information here, this one I think will be more familiar to us. So and it will bring in a critical perspective, and I know you all have been working with critical theory in your care group, so this might be more familiar terrain for you. And then on Friday we'll finish up with the autoethnographies, but I purposely didn't assign any reading for tomorrow. There really wasn't one that I thought was appropriate. But there's 2 readings on Friday, so you may want to read another one for tomorrow. And I think, as I sat here weeping, watching the film, maybe the best one to read for tomorrow, and we won't discuss it till Friday, is the one by Ellis talking about emotion in narrative. Because I think it's a good follow-up for today. Okay, you guys, thank you for sticking with me here.
I've never heard of that movie before.
I guess it's old enough that it hasn't been, and you know what, I kind of forgot about it, and a couple weeks before I came here, as I was preparing, it happened to be on TV, and I had forgotten about Lorenzo Soil, and I thought, for activism, this is a good one.
Well, the Wikipedia said it was a commercial flop.
Really?
When it was released.
Well,
I didn't do well.
because
It was
a lot of
current.
times it's a hard movie to watch in a lot of ways. To watch a child suffering like that is tough.
This one?
So that's not surprising.
Wow, I think it's so wonderful.
It's interesting that was fun.
I if you all go and read the Wikipedia,
Of Lorenzo's oil.
it's so, the way it was written, I was just glancing through the movie, the way it was written was so careful. You know, like, I think they said Lorenzo's oil is still not a cure, it has not been proven in any testing. Although it has been, anecdotally it looks like it's working, but apparently it's not been statistically proven or clinically proven yet. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if they've had them, if they gave the money to do a large-scale clinical trial. And the other thing is, with clinical trials, you have to randomize.
Yeah.
So somebody would be, I mean, not somebody, a lot of people would have to agree to get a random treatment. And if it was my kid, I would have a hard time doing a random, being one of the random participants.
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation we had about research and like communication research and activism versus journalism, and how quickly journalism can
Get the message out
spur, but to write a paper, revise and resubmit, submit to it takes just such a long process, and so.
And there's reasons for that. I mean, there's reasons to be careful, but then just, you know, the same with the AIDS activists, when you don't have time to do that. I don't know if I was a parent of a child like that.
I mean, really seeing the time frame that they had, at least it was written down when he was reading at the beginning before he was crying and fell down the stairs. It's like, by 9 months your kid could be dead. And then imagine the president telling you of the foundation, like, no, stay on the trial. It's 6 months long.
Yeah.
You know?
I think one sentence he said that I thought was so, just captured it all, is she said, I guess the risk isn't worth the consequence, or the risk isn't worth
The risk
the loss
reward
of,
ratio
right.
or something like that.
And it's true, I mean, it's true, and I think that's the power of narratives, is that became more of a consequence to him, like knowing the narrative of this family, like that became more consequential, but separated from the narrative, his reward isn't worth the consequence, and theirs is. Like their risk is, anything is worth the consequences. So I think that's that line to me was really important about where narratives can really add to this like idea of what the consequence could be.
There's a book by an old friend of mine in Chicago, Catherine, well, now she's Catherine Montgomery, but she had been Catherine Hunter when she wrote this, and it's a book called Doctor's Stories, and she's a literature and medicine person, kind of like Rita Sharon, and she did a kind of ethnographic study where she followed doctors around in a hospital on their rounds, on their daily rounds, and also conversations with each other. And this is not to say clinical trials are wrong, because clinical trials serve a very important purpose. However, what she was able to detail in terms of following the doctors around and capturing what they were saying is that as much as a clinical trial is the gold standard for medicine, and nowadays we talk about evidence-based medicine, we want to do things on the basis of scientific evidence, and that's a good thing too. But in reality, the anecdotal evidence really is the basis for what a lot of doctors are doing. So I don't think that can be dismissed either. And then there's dilemmas in balancing all those things. But she provides a lot of examples of really where it's the individual stories that are the determining factor for what doctors are recommending.